Well, welcome everybody. It's Paul Lowe here, one of the founding members of OpenEye, and we're delighted today to introduce you to the Bag News Notes team, who are going to be facilitating today's webinar, which is looking at the impact of the visual coverage of the BP oil spill. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Michael Shaw to explain to you a little bit about Bag News Notes and how they work and who today's participants are.
Hi, I'm Michael Shaw, and I wanted to welcome you to the first Bag News Salon at OpenEye. I wanted to thank Paul for hosting us and say what an honor it is to have John Moore, Erica Blumenfeld, and Carrie Goodnow with us as well as Sandra Roa, the editor of Bag News Salon, Lorette Steinberg, who completely produced this discussion, our talented moderator and visual rhetorician, Kara Finnegan, as well as visual experts Nate Stormer and John Levy of Photo 8. And yes, I'm very happy to have a mixed British and American panel on this story. I wanted to say a few words about the salon, our process, and the Bag News site. This is our 7th salon, having looked into photos on Haiti, Obama, Katrina in New Orleans, 9/11, etc. It's also the first time we're using live video instead of text chat, and we're interested to see how a free-form discussion will work on this platform, especially since OpenEye has never done an unstructured discussion like this before. At Bag News, we feel we have a unique mission when it comes to photojournalism. If others relate to photographs more for their informational content or their backstory, at Bag News, we're particularly concerned with the photo itself. We're interested in two things. First, what is the function of the actual photo as an emotionally and intellectually charged element in the media, as well as the cultural and political sphere? Second, we're interested in how much we can understand from a particular photo if we consider it like a cultural mirror and read it more like a short story, assuming a strong photo is much richer than people imagine in details, storylines, suggestions, contradictions, associations, and ironies. Finally, if you're not familiar with Bag News itself, the site is a daily meeting place for concerned citizens and activists, photographers, and visual experts and academics to discuss and debate the key images of our times. Our notes section analyzes visual politics, and our originals section, edited by photographer Alan Chin, publishes photojournalism, emphasizing our unique approach. So we encourage everyone to visit regularly, to comment, to visit our Facebook group, and also follow us on Twitter. All that said, I now give you Kara Finnegan.
What I wanted to do before we dive into this image, which is a great way to start our discussion, is to briefly mention that we're honored to have several photographers who have been working actively in the Gulf joining us today. I want to introduce especially 3 of them whose photographs appear in this edit, and we will talk to them and about these photographs as we move through today. John Moore is a senior staff photographer for Getty Images, who has extensively covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's won numerous awards for his work, including sharing a 2005 Pulitzer Prize for breaking news photography for coverage of the war in Iraq. Carrie Goodnow is a freelance and documentary photographer based in Mobile, Alabama. Her work covers a wide range of topics in the region and stories along the Gulf Coast. She's been working on those as a freelancer, most recently with Bloomberg News. And she's also interested in documenting stories often missed by the mainstream media. The third photographer who's with us, whose work we will discuss today, is Erica Blumenfeld. She's an artist and documentary photographer working on the Polar Project, a series of environment-based art installations. And most recently, she's been filing reports on the Gulf in collaboration with independent journalist Dar Jamal. I also want to note the presence of Gerald Herbert, another photographer who has been doing work in the Gulf as well. And we're really honored to have everyone here today, and especially these guest photographers who are willing to share their work and talk with us about their work. But Michael emphasized that the role of the bag is really to read the pictures, as the bag slogan says, and to talk about the images. And so we wanted to begin today by this image, which is an image of, among other things, the journalist Anderson Cooper. To me, this image encapsulates a lot of what the bag is about, how news and politics are visualized by media and in media. And in particular, Michael talked about the notion of images reflecting. And so at this point, I invite folks to jump in and comment, and let's get going on the images here.
I guess
Lorette.
Lorette here. I'd like to
ask the photographers who are here what they think when they see this photograph. I mean, we know that all of you who are participating today are not in broadcast media. We don't hear your voices, and I just would like to know what kinds of things come to mind.
Hi, it's John here. I thought I'd just check and see if you can hear me, first of all.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, very good.
Well, this picture by Win McNamee, he went out and was out on a boat for many hours for this photograph. And like many of us who've covered this story, there's a lot of time spent just getting where you need to be, and just the logistics of getting to where he could make this picture in the first place were a huge hurdle. And then working with Tough Light as we've done day after day on the story, I think it's just a fantastic picture.
Without reading this caption, I wouldn't actually know that it's Anderson Cooper. Being in the UK, I wouldn't really particularly understand the relevance of it being Anderson Cooper. However, I do understand that getting into this kind of situation where you're right, kind of on the water, so to speak, has been quite a hard thing for photographers to do. So I wonder whether just in this situation there's perhaps a kind of an alliance between TV news, perhaps, that can get that access, and still photography that can benefit from it.
That's a really good point, and I think in some ways the image itself highlights what you get when photographers are there. And one of the things I think about this image that's so compelling is the texture, and you can see the structure of the oil and the water in ways that aren't often communicated in other images. And I think we'll see some other examples of that today. But for me, the sort of textural or viscous quality is really pictured really nicely here.
Yeah, absolutely. As John was saying, though, that it's been quite hard to kind of find the access to these kind of pictures, I guess.
Yeah, I just want to note for those of you, if you look over to the left in the text box, Michael's going to insert the captions for each of the images as we work through them, so you can see the full caption there and what Michael just typed. John, I see a hand up. Did you have a question? Or
No, I think it's more me getting used to the system here more than anything. As I mentioned before, just the logistics of getting around and getting fresh pictures that are different has been very tough. And part of this image here has to do with the fact that we're out there on the water, and we photograph whoever we can find, whether it's rescue personnel or, in this case, other journalists on the same boat.
Is there perhaps, like for the American market, an added profundity to have a reporter like Anderson there in the picture, kind of making it front and center a topic that they can then all kind of relate to in that sense?
in the text comments, Nathan and Gerald are having a kind of conversation about whether this is ocean, whether this is marsh, and how that's pictured. And I wonder if one of them might want to jump in verbally as well.
It's Paul. Sorry, I'm just diving in without having. I'm using the wrong protocol. I think it's kind of interesting, though, this idea of Anderson Cooper as the figurehead of CNN now, especially now that Chris and Alan Paul has gone, and the coverage, the rather negative coverage he got of being in Haiti, and I'm wondering how, does the story become the media celebrity's presence there in order to validate the story or not? In other words, why is a picture of Anderson Cooper even important in the first place? So what is it saying about the story that we almost need this kind of celebrity fime and presence on a story in order to validate it or bring it up to the level that it's seen as being an internationally important event?
I think that might be
and folks can just jump in too. I don't need to call on.
I think that might be a kind of a good way of reading it, but also perhaps a bit unfair. Because as John was saying, getting access to these kind of situations can be extremely difficult. And I'd hazard a guess that in this situation, Reuters and CNN either shared a boat or followed each other or found access at the same time. And having a person in the picture obviously kind of gives it a human dimension and actually brings it back. But to a certain degree, I would agree as well, because Anderson Cooper, being a celebrity like that, is obviously a better person to have in your picture than Joe Bloggs from the local Herald.
And that's the one that gets circulated too, right? Erica, you've had your hand up for a while. I'm sorry.
No worries. Can you hear me okay this time?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of actually say similar things to what's being said. Is just, you know, it's clear from the image, obviously, the amazing access they were given. I certainly haven't seen this sort of thing with my own eyes because it's been so difficult to get as close to the oil as I may want to. And I do agree that it's so important, I think, to continue to reflect back to humanizing this catastrophe, because I think with it being such a technological catastrophe, it's very easy to look at the corporation and not at the human quality of it. And so in that respect, I feel like the image, you know, portraying the reflection of a person is sort of effective. But it's true that because it's Anderson Cooper, it does sort of, for me, linger with this ongoing question of the idea of the press and the sort of celebrity of that, instead of, you know, the focus on the people who are being affected, and you know, using media as additional PR for getting access to the catastrophe, as opposed to actually focusing on the catastrophe itself and how it's actually affecting the fishermen and the fisher people and the locals here who are living with this.
Dr. Lawrence here. Erica, thank you. One of the things that this image seems to remind me of is the old saw that it's not really a story unless the media shows up. I know that right now the story is going to change some because, well, you know, it's over, right? A couple of headlines in major newspapers said that. Do you think that part of this image is that it's a big story because important media people are there?
I think that, you know, I think that that's implied, and I think that it's the implication of that is something that I think is sort of dangerous. You know, I've been down here for 3 weeks now, and you know, we've had a lot of difficulty getting access to areas, but at the same time, we're also seeing that there's just not that much media down here anymore. And there's not as much coverage, and I think there is this sensibility that it's not the hot topic anymore because you know, the PR and the media has definitely led people to believe that this issue's over, or at least it's under control. And I think, you know, these things are misleading, and certainly the repercussions of the situation, even if they have gotten the oil leaking under some form of control, is, you know, years and years. And we've been talking with people here who seem to feel like the media has given up on them.
In the context of thinking about notions of access and also thinking about how an image itself can kind of invite us to think about the future, I wonder if we might move to the next slide, which is Carrie Goodno's image, in fact, and talk a little bit about that image. It certainly suggests a particular kind of access. I'm going to click on it now, so hopefully you should all be seeing it. It suggests a particular kind of access, visual, and maybe behind-the-scenes access to the story. And Carrie, I wonder, you know, in keeping with the bag's interest in focusing on the pictures and reading the pictures, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the ways that this photograph, you know, what kind of compositional choices are you making here in terms of what kinds of things you want to communicate to viewers?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I had a conversation with Lorette a couple of days ago about how do you show people in tourism, you know, in a photograph in representing the oil spill and how it's affecting people. And you know, we talked about, you know, the people on the beaches playing in the water, you know, digging up in the sand and all of that. And this was just, you know, an opportunity that I had to go up in the air and photograph it from looking down. And I saw these empty beach chairs, and I thought, well, you know, that's very representative. And, you know, I do have some images where I zoomed in on the oil and got that pattern in just in a single image. But then I thought, you know, it's very important to also include the human aspect of it, as we talked about in the previous image. And it was just a way for me to show, I don't know if it's, you know, subtly or not. So that's sort of why I tried to include the you know, the empty beach chairs in that. You know, I don't know how that if that helps at all, but
Yeah, I think it, Carrie, for me, one of the things, go ahead, Lorette. It seems that a few people have been texting in the box that they're not able to see the image. So if people could hit check mark if you can see the image that Carrie's just been describing with the beach chairs and the from above. Okay, so some folks are seeing it and some folks are not seeing it. So check the X if you're not and the check mark if you are.
Everybody, if you just try to resize your screen, the window screen, sometimes that helps reboot the image. So just, you know, slightly scroll up and down the screen or resize it. Sometimes it's a little bit slow coming through. I'm just going to try and reload the picture now as well so we get it. So you may see the image change to one of the pelicans and then change back to one of the beach chairs.
Photo Boogie in the text box has also published the URL where all the images are, so that's another great way to look at the images if you're not able to see them right above in your window. Thanks. Your window. Okay, so
in the meantime,
so we had a little bit of a
Carrie, maybe you can talk a little bit.
Lorette, I think you were commenting, but we've been cut off here. Talking about this notion of
I was going
the
to
future.
Go. One of the things that we had touched on in the previous image had to do with access, and I know Carrie had talked a bit about that with me the other day. At the time she was in, that she made this photograph, Carrie, you were in a military helicopter?
yeah, I was in an Army helicopter, and it's a spotting mission where the Coast Guard and the Army go up in a small helicopter called the Lakota, and they basically just look for oil and communicate below to the skimming vessels and other Coast Guard boats as to where exactly the oil is. And they go up on a daily basis, you know, sometimes 2-3 times a day, and they take media up. I've had, you know, really no trouble on my end as far as getting up in the air on these missions, but that was where I was when I was photographing.
Can I just jump in and ask a little bit about access, because it's hard for us in the UK, perhaps without so much coverage, to appreciate it. But from our point of view, from my point of view, I would kind of find it hard that there's difficulty getting access. When are we not talking about hundreds of miles of coastline and waters that stretch for thousands of square miles, and boats that people can rent, and helicopters that you could, you know, take privately to see this? Is this really such a difficult thing to get close to?
Maybe John and Erica can address that. How hard has it been?
You mean in terms of getting close to the spill?
close
Sure.
to any kind of evidences of the spill. The spill itself, obviously, the rig or the underwater pipe is, live TV, but the story is surely the effects and the places that it washes up. Is it really that possible to restrict access to all those places?
Well, usually the oil is coming in at specific places depending on the tides. And so one of the real difficult things in covering the story is that you're moving all along the coastline, along the Gulf, and that coastline is not a continuous coastline. It's a delta. It's not a straight line. You have to go to get from one part of the coast to the other. You often have to drive all the way up to New Orleans and then back to another place. And so logistically, in terms of you do a lot of driving, but also in terms of actual access. When I was there, once I went to this beach, and I was told by a soldier that I needed to go to the community center there in Grand Isle to get to the public affairs officer to bring me down. And I said, well, who does he work for? And he said, well, he works for BP. You have to go down with the BP representative, otherwise you can't get access to the coast.
Right, I understand. Can I just jump in also just to talk about this picture of Carrie's? I think that it's effective for a number of reasons, like she said, with the deck chairs. But also I think it's the parts to the right of the picture that are kind of seemingly clear, and then that big cloud on the left that, even without the deck chairs, it just has a very ominous quality to it, as well as the stains on the sand next to the very pristine sand. So I think it is obviously the tourism and the illustration of that, but it's also got a very inherent kind of foreboding about it.
I think that's true, and for me it's also very interesting. There's literally a kind of line in the sand drawn across, the good beach to the, affected beach. And that plus the composition of the chairs at the very top of the image, to me, right, is this kind of impending sense of doom almost.
For me also, this is Michael, it seems to have a class resonance to it as well, in that the beach is very wide, and the chairs look very expensive, and so whether or not that's really true, it does feel like one message to me is that when we have these natural catastrophes, perhaps nobody is spared, from the top of the economic food chain to the bottom.
Absolutely.
Nathan, you had a comment that I'm afraid I have not gotten it.
Hi. I'm been thinking sort of sideways to this conversation about how we're so unused to seeing oil. It's always in containment. And so when it overspills, there's obviously the specific nature of the disaster, but just in general, we don't see oil very much. And how horrifying, but also, especially the last two images, it can be also strangely beautiful. So visually, it's just something quite unusual. We're used to seeing lots of different kinds of disasters, but there's a peculiar quality to this one that I can't quite get words around. But seeing so much oil is just not normal.
One of the things
Lorette
here, I'm sorry. One of the things I'm reminded of in this photograph is the aesthetics of the Jaws posters when that film was first out, with the horror from below, coming towards the people or things that don't know it's there.
Yes,
yeah. Erica, you had a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to just comment on this photograph, which I think is beautiful and is very effective in many ways. And one of the things that I find so powerful about it is that the line of chairs and umbrellas sort of has this very kind of controlled and sort of rhythmic quality to it, and the chaos and the uncontrolled quality of the oil and the water, and just the sort of the knowing of how uncontrollable that force is. I think there's a really interesting comparison between these two elements that I think is really important.
That might be a
Absolutely.
good transition, actually, to the next image. Charlie Rydell's. Actually, we've got a pair of images, the very widely circulated images that he made. If we could move to that, Paul, I'm going to let you do that because I don't know if I have control so that everyone can see.
Does the image come up with now? Has the image moved on now?
Yeah, I'm not getting one either, Paul.
Well, my screen just went blank, so I think Paul's working on that. One of the questions that, there they are. I think at least I'm seeing them now. I hope others are as well. Click the yes box or the check mark box in your box, the green one, if you're seeing these, just so we can give Paul a sense. These two images, I don't have any data. I haven't counted. I imagine they are two of the most widely circulated images of the crisis. And one of the things I think that we often tend to look for, fairly or unfairly, in moments such as these, is what will be so-called, the so-called iconic photograph. What will be the shot that we remember, that we republish 50 years from now, et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if people are welcome to comment on that, but also let's talk about the images as images. And if we're willing to say that these images are remarkable and deserve to be recirculated, what is it about them? Let's really read these pictures. Remember, if you can't quite see them, you've also got the URL. You can go there and look at them as well.
Yeah, I posted a link to the images, to the juxtaposition. They're probably a little bit small on that link, but you can see them in a new window.
Lorette here. One of the things that I keep coming back to is the pelican on the left. Just resonates in terms of a phoenix trying to rise, and it does not have any chance of rising. The fact that it is still calling and its wings are trying to lift up is so horrifying to me. And I noticed that Gerald also talked about it as the image is raising the bar and so on. So maybe we can pay attention to what he's posting on the left. I think his microphone's not working, but for me, that the pelican is going to be in my mind's eye forever.
Lorette, I hadn't thought about that, the power of birds as opposed to other animals. Go ahead. I just talked over somebody. Sorry.
Sorry, this is Sandra. I just kind of wanted to point over to the image on the right. To me, it seems like this is really like a different incarnation of an animal impacted by the oil, because it kind of seems like it's attempting to crawl out, which is, I think, to me, is a new way of presenting that experience from the animal.
Yeah, I think there's something quite apocalyptic about the image on the right. Like you say, because it's so unidentifiable as a particular animal, and the oil and the situation has had that kind of effect completely on it. So you can only really identify it from that tiny little eye. It's really quite a pathetic and terrible-looking image of a bird.
Michael here. Yeah, I think that when these pictures first appeared, and it was the third week, I believe, of the crisis, and each week, at least the two previous weeks, we'd started seeing birds that had been affected by oil, but these did, I think someone said, raise the bar, and were just really horrifying and ghastly, and maybe, although maybe it's a academic exercise to say, is there an iconic image, or are there iconic images from the crisis? These may be it. The mummified bird, to me, because it looks so much on one level like a statue, conveys a kind of dignity and also a timeliness a timelessness. It seems like something that on one level you could see as a statue, something that would belong in a museum, and to that extent it conveys a kind of history-making resonance to it, as much as it also is incredibly visceral and evokes a sense of horror.
Yeah, Michael, I think you're right. For me, the part of the visceral sense is, again, that textural element, that feeling that you could reach into that image, especially the one on the right, and touch the goo and feel, the viscosity, and one might imagine, being covered by this oneself. Lorette, you had a comment.
Yes, I noticed that John said that things like oiled crabs and fish just don't have the potential for the same kind of anguish. And I wondered, John, if you could talk about that, because it's a problem photographers always have, is looking for a subject that could best convey what you see.
Well, certainly, I think all of us down there have tried to cover different types of wildlife that have been affected by the spill. I've seen lots of fish, and as I mentioned in the text there, crabs and other types of wildlife. The oiled bird is just it becomes and we all knew it would be iconic. I think most of us who've worked that story searched for oiled birds the whole time there. And when these came out, and Gerald as well had some really, really impactful pictures of oiled birds as well. But when these came out, they really did set a new and horrible standard for wildlife photography on this disaster coverage.
John, since you just commented and talked a little bit about photographers, what they seek out and what they're looking for when they're in a context like this, I wonder if we might move on to your photograph, the photograph of the beach.
Can I just jump in? Sandra has asked a question.
Sure.
Before we move on quickly. Is it hard to find oiled birds? Is the question from Sandra. I'd like to know.
I would say so, and we know the problem is we know they exist. They're out there. Getting access to really any part of the story is tough, and specifically finding the birds, I found so. There is, of course, a center where a rescue center for these birds at Fort Jackson Center. They give media access there, and you can photograph them there, but it's quite something different to see them on the beach, I think.
Yes.
There's a kind of wonderful parallel conversation going on in the text box, so I encourage folks to kind of be looking back and forth as we talk here. This is one of the nice things about having the audio available along with the text and URLs and other things being posted. John, we've switched now, at least I think on my screen I have switched now to the fourth slide that we're going to discuss today, which is your photograph. And I would say that this is arguably the moodiest, perhaps, of the pictures in our edit. And I wonder if it's fair to say that the tone of this photograph is suggesting your particular way of reading the crisis. I see this as a news photograph in one sense. I mean, it's captioned as such. But I also see this as a real kind of commentary on what's going on in the Gulf. And I wondered if you talk a little bit about how this photograph, how you structured it, and what tone you were hoping to communicate.
Well, this picture was taken in a little place called Elmer's Island. I was escorted by a sheriff's deputy down the beach at dawn, and the storm rolled in off the Gulf as I was there along the beach. For me, it really, the sort of symbolic, if you will, idea that the worst was on the horizon. That this wasn't over, and that sort of I don't know. I hate to say stormy weather, but things were going to get worse before they got better, and that was certainly the case. It got much worse.
Here too, I know I keep harping on this, but I really keep seeing textures, and I'm noticing in the comments some folks are talking about how some of these things look like animals, body bags. There's, again, a variety of natural and we might say unnatural elements kind of merging here in this photograph that, for me, make it really compelling. Erica, you had a comment.
Yeah, one of the things I just wanted to say too that I think is so powerful about this image, and it not just because of the mood and the quality of light and sort of the foreboding sense of things, but also it really does speak to the futility of the booming efforts, and certainly what I've seen, and I'm sure folks who've been down here have seen as well, and I think that's such an powerful thing to communicate as well. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
No, I'd agree. I think it has this almost feeling of futility to it. The way that the booms are kind of discarded at the end of the day, stacked up there, like rubbish to take away. But there's really a whole lot more coming in from the sea, and it just feels so kind of not pointless, but so much effort for so little gain in that method.
Yeah, Michael here. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to mention, this is John. I struggled with this during the whole time I was down there. When you fly over this spill, you see it's so vast. It's so vast, and it's everywhere, and it's very hard to capture. It was for me in a single still image, as whether it was overflights or just walking along the beach. That was really the struggle, and maybe more so in stills than video. But that's another topic. Just to show the dimensions of it. I got it right very few times, I think, during those weeks there.
Yeah, Michael here. I'm glad to hear John talk about the image as so successful. We were a little nervous, actually, in terms of which John Moore image to use in the edit, because there's so many to choose from that are so impressive. But this picture, to me, is incredibly striking in its moodiness, I think. And there's a number of dimensions to it that really strike me. One is that I find it, apocalyptic almost in its intensity. But then on the same time, it's more complex than that, because you have the light and you have the dark. So just when you start feeling like this is speaking to hopelessness, the light and the breaking of the light, you start to feel like there's a theme of hope there also. And then picking up on what Erica was saying, too, about the booms, I think on one level, more symbolically, there's something so somatic about looking at these booms that are the ones that have been used up and are soaked with oil. Alan Chin had a photo that had some of the same effect on Bag News. But, I look at some of these images, and the booms, they look like human intestines. And from there, it's not much of a jump to feel like, this is a disaster that, can, literally rip your guts out. And then I also think that, and again, the photo is so rich, the tractor cuts in the sand to form the berm, also reflect to me just how aggressive, man can be on the environment. And, and then more literally, it just reminds me of this plan that Governor Jindal and others have been pushing, or were pushing, to bulldoze sand into the Gulf. So I just think there's so many things that this photo is doing. I just find it really impressive.
Gerald, I think you've had a hand up. I wanted to give you a chance to get in. Do you have audio now? I see a light, but then I don't see a light, so maybe not. But I know that there are other comments that you've had about this image throughout as well. Let me jump to Nathan for maybe a final comment on this picture.
Well, on this particular, it's not so much on this particular picture, but on the comments about access and then being unable to really see it. And that's one of the things I find also very powerful about this whole disaster is the sense in which, to some extent, most of us are only going to feel it only very, very indirectly. If your livelihood is not directly connected to the oil industry, if you're not down on the Gulf, you just don't feel it. And so here's this monstrous, enormous disaster, and it's remarkably intangible. And so the photos, I think, are actually quite successful at making it tangible. But as you say, the scale of it is almost impossible to be grasped.
Yeah, I'm thinking especially of this the idea that the last few pictures, and it depends on whether you want to anthropomorphize the birds or not, but we've had Anderson Cooper's reflection, and then we have images where there aren't people. And I find that kind of interesting for a number of reasons, one of which is Erica and others, and I know Erica in your work you're interested in this, have been thinking about the effects on the people, what's going to happen when the story is quote unquote over, but as we know, not over, what media will or won't be there. I was thinking that it might be good for timing purposes and for discussion purposes maybe to jump, if we could, to slide 7, which is Erica's photograph of the cannot fish sign. And I'd like to talk about that, I think, here, because in some ways it's a kind of interesting pairing. I'm now seeing it on my screen. I hope the rest of you are as well. And Erica, to me, I see this image as really symbolically dense, I guess you could say. And so I wonder if you might comment really briefly on some of the, I guess, for lack of a better word, some of the symbols and ideas that you were trying to organize in this image.
Sure. Yeah, this was our first day here. We were in the we drove down to Grand Isle, which is on the South Louisiana coastline, and this was really, some of the first indications, the signs that people had put along the highway driving down to Grand Isle, commenting on their situation. Fisher folk having signs up saying, closed thanks to BP and all of this, and so these were some of the first direct voices that we quote heard from people along the way. And this image really struck me because not only was it a local person's communication about the frustration, but to me the flag, choosing to include the flag in this photograph, to me really was trying to deal with the complex issue of the nationality or the sense of who's responsible, and the idea that BP being a British company, does that preclude our own use of oil, and it's a complex issue, and it's very, very difficult to swallow it all. And so for me, this image was trying to deal with the issues, these sorts of issues.
Yeah, and I see that in the kind of uncertain relationship that you constructed between the sign and the flag. And for me, this might seem like a minor visual point, but for me, the fact that the flag is waving, right, and you can see the wind is kind of generally blowing off to the left of the image, to me that gives the sign, which is itself relatively static. It gives the sign almost a kind of animation, so that for me, the sign is kind of pulsing with this set of questions. What are we supposed to do?
I think you're right. I mean, I think it's there's both. There is this sense of staticness. How can we move the oil? The oil is sort of has a life of its own, and it's moving with the currents of the ocean, and it has this sort of uncontrolled quality. And of course, there's a lot of fear that comes up when we realize the kind of gravity and the enormity of this thing, and so we look. I think that we look to our leaders to help contain the enormity of it, and yet we're not seeing a lot of real leadership in this, both in our own nation and in the corporate world of BP. And so it's complex, and I think that I'd be curious to hear what other people think about this, how other people have been feeling about this in both images and in the media and in their own experiences down here, how we deal with our own complicity, as well as realizing that the responsibility of this is beyond just the corporation and our nation and but also as individuals. And I don't know, I think it's a really, really interesting and really deeply philosophical and complex issue.
This is Nathan. This reminds me, I was thinking of this very issue back with the first image too, to sort of read these side by side, is that the oil slick with Anderson Cooper is a very muddy mirror back upon us. You wouldn't necessarily know that is Anderson Cooper. And this image also reflects the oil spill back to us. The other images do more indirectly. We sort of feel the horror of it, but both of those, I think, this image and the first one, directly make a comment back onto us as a community and not just BP, but what does this say about ourselves? This one in the form of a very direct question about livelihood.
Yeah, Photo Boogie, question, comment.
Yeah, I'd agree with Nathan very much so there, that they kind of do ask the question or almost demand a response from the viewer in a way that some of the other ones actually you live a bit longer with and they seep into your imagination. The question that I have, though, is with these pictures, they obviously seem to work very, very well in a very clear and present sense of this is what it's about. With this particular picture, though, and I have a feeling towards signage in general, I think this is the start of a very interesting set of pictures on how do people feed their kids. If there's such a huge disaster, then obviously the news of it is one thing, but the way it manifests itself in people's lives is surely a much better thing to photograph. So outside of the signage, I kind of like to see, like the boats tied up on the shore, the fishing boats that can't go out to fish, these kind of real manifestations of people finding it hard to feed their kids, or else it's just a headline.
Yeah, I hear you, and we have, from here we went, we have gone deep into that. We've met with the Native American population, sort of east of Grand Isle, and went out in the boats with the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe, and saw how it's affecting them. Their fishing areas are completely closed. They can only get crabs in the canals, which the bayous, which are no longer, well, they're still open for the moment. And I think it's true. I mean, from there, we've been mostly talking with fisherfolk and locals about how people are surviving. In fact, that's we're down here in Orange Beach right now, interviewing people about how they're going to sustain through this the catastrophe. And I think it's important, and I think you're totally right. It's getting underneath the veneer of the voices and getting to the people and the voices themselves, and looking at the real long-term effect that this has, because it's not just today and tomorrow and this last few weeks, but it's how are they going to continue to feed themselves for the next 10 years.
And in some senses, that goes back to what Kara was saying about, the great proclamation that the cap is on and it's all over. And actually, as you say, the story is far from over, and that's the one that wants to be covered.
John Moore, you had a comment.
Yes, the relationship that a lot of folks in Louisiana have with the oil industry also complicates the coverage quite a bit. You would expect in many places with a disaster of this size that there would be huge protests, not now and again, but every day, all the time. And often the protest pictures that we've seen, a lot of the protest pictures we've seen to the BP disaster have come from other parts of the country. People in Louisiana, a lot of folks rely on the oil business for their livelihood in the past, and a lot of them expect that there will be some sort of payout, whether they're having their boats hired to help with the cleanup effort in the present tense, or whether they're hoping to get money later on. I think a lot of people are afraid to come out and openly protest and in a way that we would expect.
Lorette here. I guess this would come as a question that I would put out to all of the photographers. One of the points that I often make to people is audiences generally think that photographers can make photographs and will show us everything there is to be shown. But I know I've talked with a couple of you who have said none of the people I work for are interested in me showing the people who are not getting work, showing me the stories of the people who are suffering real changes in culture and livelihood. I know that Erica is able to do this as a documentary person, but of course then you also have to find out how to make a living. I know Carrie has mentioned that the people she works for are not interested in paying her to go and do those kinds of stories that we say, well, why aren't we seeing these stories? But I wondered if Gerald or John, and actually Erica and Carrie also could address that in terms of, I know that there are things you want to show. What are we not seeing?
Great question, Lorette.
Well, I can speak for myself. This is John. I did some of it, and I got at some of it, but I would have liked to have done a lot more. It's as I mentioned, it's really complicated, and showing people not working that does make pictures, but it's not easy to do, and a lot of folks aren't really all that interested in us doing that. I found people who did want their stories told, but I found a lot of people who didn't.
I think it's an interesting question, and certainly a complicated one too. I mean, we've been extremely lucky, I think, down here in our abilities to have access to people who are willing to connect with us about their personal experiences. But it's really complicated because oftentimes we'll meet with one spouse who is willing to talk, but the other one is on the boat that's been hired by BP, and so there's certain things that can't be said, or we can't speak to both people. And it's interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing is or wondering about is, over time, how are the relationships between the Fisher people and the folks who are working now for BP in the cleanup, as that fades and they're no longer getting paychecks from BP. How is this going to affect these people's livelihoods and their family structures and their relationships over time? I think this is a really important aspect that isn't being talked about, and just in terms of access or publication of it, I think one benefit of being independent is that, you know, we are able to do these stories, you know, on our own, and then find outlets to publish them. But again, like you said, it's more challenging in that sense to get paid for the work. So it's a toss-up. But yeah, I think it's really important.
Nathan here. I was just thinking during this whole last discussion about what the visual field is going to be like post-containment, if we actually are post-containment, the rules of access that might change. Will we see more images, even more shots of oil, but oil that is being triumphed over and people going back to work? So we'll actually have much more visual information, but only when it's a more pleasant story to be telling, so that the previous story is dampened in terms of our memories.
Is that not the point then, is it Carrie or Laurie or Erica was saying, for the independence of the photographers to perhaps, you know, be given that extra choice of sticking with the story and saying in those situations it's not so. Post-containment, there are people's lives still ongoing and affected. And also being able to spend a longer period of time to create a body of work that really is far more compelling, I suppose, and helps it get published in that way.
Paul, you had a comment.
Well, I mean, I guess what we'll probably see is a sudden opening up of photo ops as BP and the administration try to, you know, media manage it, and you'll get lots of pictures of birds being cleaned up and, you know, photo opportunities with maybe the BP guys, you know, showing what a great job they're suddenly doing with the cleanup and the containment. And then I guess it'll be very much like what happened with New Orleans and Haiti and pretty much every other major either man-made or natural disaster. It'll just disappear off the media map until maybe there'll be an anniversary piece in a year's time kind of thing. And I think this is a really important issue for the media to take on. You know, huge amounts of resources in terms of manpower, financial resources, and so on are dedicated to breaking news stories, as it were, and virtually nothing to then covering those stories as they carry on. Or even more importantly, trying to work out where those stories might be happening in the future. Because if you think about this whole BP issue, you know, clearly many of the oil companies were riding roughshod over all sorts of safety issues, all sorts of environmental issues in their deep water drilling. There were lots of people, you know, green and environmentalists trying to lobby against that, but it was completely invisible on the media radar. And this is a really tough question for media practitioners, particularly independent media practitioners like ourselves, to take on board. How do we kind of flag up the potential of these kind of threats, you know, as they're coming up? And then how do we stick with them, and how do we hang on in there afterwards in order to show how these are not just blips, as it were, that suddenly appear and then, you know, everybody's hunky-dory and happy afterwards. You know, time and time again, we see the same pattern of a kind of a, you know, a bell curve in interest, as it were, with the peak being in the middle and then it disappearing very, very fast off the other side, almost like falling off a cliff. I think we're seeing that already with this story. So trying to think about strategies for supporting independent journalism to do the stories before they happen, you know, to put down the groundwork for them, and then to keep on covering them after they happen, I think is a really key issue to try and take on board as an industry.
Yeah, Paul, I think you're right, and particularly in light of the question of policymakers, right? So we might actually move on to the image of Tony Hayward in that regard. I don't know if other folks had comments that might we might consider those comments alongside an image like this, which is dated in a way, but not dated for all of the reasons that Paul just suggested.
And Kara, look at the comment that John made in type. Many news organizations already have their budgets gutted by Haiti. Again, the budgets are also going to predict what photographs we're going to see, not just the photographers, what they choose to photograph.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm particularly interested with this image of Tony Hayward to maybe hear a little bit from some of the British folks in our panel and our audience today. How does this image read for you, or how did it, or images like it, read for you from the British context?
Oh, now I know why we were invited.
Jenny, do you want to speak to that, Jenny? Because I see Jenny's got her hand up, and I know she's British, so if she wants to pop in there.
Thanks, Paul. It was more of a general point, really, but just talking about the whole range of these images. I was having a conversation with Michael and Paul about this last week, and just what really strikes me about this is that a lot of what these photographs are trying to do is to visualize the unvisualizable, I guess, and that's what's interesting to me about them. Not because oil is invisible, but because it's actually, because of the nature of what's going on, it takes a real skill and particular kind of creativity for photographers to capture this. And a lot of what we're seeing is almost visual metaphors of what can we find that will represent the enormity of this, because the enormity of it itself cannot be captured, and that's in opposition maybe to a situation like Haiti, where there are so many directly affected people who we can photograph, I suppose. And what this leads me to think as well is about the issue of the photographing of environmental and ecological issues going forward as well, that this is only going to, I guess, become more serious. We're only going to have more situations of gradual, non-visually dramatic changes to the environment that are difficult to try and visualize and to capture. This particular picture that we're seeing is obviously an exception to that, because here is a person, and it's obviously here is a person who is news in this sense. But it's leading me to think about ecological issues going forward, and the challenge that that's going to be for almost the creativity of photographers to find these kind of visual metaphors to represent the enormity of what's going on.
I mean, this image to me just looks like a corporate, shoot straight out of a corporate ad for BP. It's got all those classic, if you were going to do a portrait of the CEO of BP for their annual report, the pointing off into the middle distance is one of the classic cliches of that kind of, corporate advertising photography. And I think, even down to having the BP helmet with the logo on the front there and the rig in the background, it really does look like that sort of completely staged and posed, corporate frame. I think Jenny's point there was really interesting, and I wonder whether that's partly to do with one of the reasons why the editors have been loath to do much about the human impact of this, because in most cases the humans have been separated from the environmental disaster by physical space. You don't have the fishermen and the oil slicks together because they've been kept apart. Whereas, as Jenny said, with someone like Haiti or a lot of earthquake-style disasters, the people are literally wandering through, picking through the rubble. And I wonder if that's been part of the problem. The editors have not been able to, work out a way to visualize the impact on the human beings, but also contains within the frame the story of the oil. And I think that's possibly part of the reason why we've had very little coverage of the human impact of this, because it's hard to show that in one frame. You don't have a picture of, as we said, a fisherman trying to fish in an oil slick, because they're simply not allowed to go out there in the first place.
That's a great point, and both you and Jen's point work together. I've been thinking about, during this whole discussion about, and we've talked about a variety of reasons: budgets, editorial practices, the very complicated work of photographing this kind of disaster, all the restrictions on access. It just feels to me that the visual memory of this disaster, despite its epic scale, is actually relatively weak. I mean, we've looked at some great images, there have been some great images, but overall I think the visual memory of what's just happened or is still ongoing is strangely weak compared to many other phenomena that we've experienced in the last few years.
Yeah, this is Michael. I think that's an interesting point. One thing that this all brings out to me too is how much this edit is how much personality really manifests now in terms of attracting attention, whether we're talking about the luminosity of Anderson Cooper or actually in the paper this morning, we did see, New York Times, we did see a wonderful photograph, lead photograph on the front page of fishermen, I believe, and people in the Gulf that were captured at a meeting. But why were they on the front page? The reason was because another kind of photogenic political rock star was down there. This guy, I forget his first name, Feinberg, the guy who had been the administrator of all the funds for the 9/11 victims, and so he was the guy that they were all looking at in the photo. So in a way, we really are in this kind of rock star era where the focus really the focus is on these personalities, and then to the extent that the people that are like the common folk are affected also, they're really just shown more in their reflection.
That's a great point, Michael, and I hope folks are following the textual comments alongside here, the discussion of this image in particular as a kind of great leader image, right, the ultimate of propaganda. And why don't we switch now to slide 9 to get a kind of, I guess, different image of leadership, or what constitutes or what leadership looks like. And that's an image of Obama, President Obama on the beach looking at tar balls. And I wonder what folks have to say, not just maybe perhaps about the contrast between Hayward and this image, but about this photograph itself.
I guess Lorette here. One of the things I was struck by is how, as I think it was Gerald pointed out, by pointing, Hayward appears to look like he's saying he's in charge, whereas in this one, Obama seems to be looking at what it is exactly he's going to be having to deal with.
I think in both images, though, like you said in the comments, the written comments, there's the propaganda that's behind the images, propaganda, the set-up nature of these images, that both actually conspire to work against them. Tony Hayward's trying to look all regal and in control and strong, and it completely subverts what's actually going on, subverts their image and subverts the message that they're trying to put out, because we know that's not the case. With the Obama one, it's the same choreography, trying to give across a different message, that it's kind of very considered, take every little step, every tiny little piece of oil matters. But again, that's completely seems to be the wrong attitude to take to something that's so enormously large as an issue.
I think it's interesting they're both focusing on the individual, as if the individual can solve the problem on their own. Tony Hayward, with a wave of his magic hand, can resolve the issue, and then President Obama can pick up every single tar ball across the whole Louisiana coastline. But I find this a rather sad image. I feel like it's quite, in a way, maybe I'm reading this wrong, but kind of belittling to Obama. It makes him look like he's kind of really confused and sort of, oh wow, is he really going to learn something by picking up a tar ball from the beach there? And I also wonder about quite a lot of these images where they're quite tightly cropped. And I wonder whether this image would have been, how that would have changed it, if he'd been much smaller in the frame and we'd had kind of this huge beach with the tiny figure of Obama, or maybe that was impossible, maybe he is surrounded by his aides. But I think that's a really important thing to think about in terms of, whenever we're looking at images, is what is outside of the frame. And clearly what's outside of this one is a whole crew of, photo op teams, the photographers, the TV crews, and all of Obama's aides and all the BP people and so on and so forth. And, when you slice these little fragments out from the stream of life, I think it's really important to bear in mind that's one of photography's great abilities, is to slice out these little elements and make them really, really, really hone down or drill down onto these little iconic moments in a way that most of the mediums are not able to do, I think.
Paul, it's interesting to see the video, or to look at the video of this photo shoot side by side with the still images, because there was so many photographers there, and he was completely surrounded. So it makes you really so appreciate, especially when the White House is involved, how much the staging and establishment of a photo op is, because it looks like a personal, solitary, and yeah, maybe actually a bit of a lonely moment in terms of your reaction, but this was a real scene.
And then, of course, we've got The Economist taking the people out of the picture as well on their cover that they ran the other week, where they decided that, they were able to remove Obama's aides from the frame and just have him lonely staring out across the ocean there. So I think not only do photographers do it, but also increasingly it seems like magazines are happy to seriously edit news pictures as well in terms of manipulating them.
I think it's a good point, though. Sorry, just quickly. In both of these pictures, I think both of them, exactly like Paul said earlier, they completely separate the people, the environment from the issue, and they try and reduce it to this kind of one figure, as though there's a blame or there's a savior. And that's a necessary part, perhaps, of covering the story and looking for where the responsibility or the answers may lie. But both of them, from the photojournalist point of view, are very limiting situations, and they play out that way in the newspapers.
I just want to break in here quickly to let everybody know that we've got about 10 minutes left. And so for those of you who are not panelists but who have graciously given us your time and attention this afternoon, if any of you have a question or a comment that you want to make about any of the images we've talked about so far, just raise your hand, click on the little hand raise button, and I'll try to get to a few of you in the last few minutes here. But Laurette, you had a comment, so I'll turn back to you briefly.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that Gerald has been typing is about photographers' perception that Obama is more standoffish, that they recognize that Bush actually would go up with victims more often. And, it's interesting that we would perceive as being more with people. It's a different kind of propaganda to me, because one of the things I know that Bag News did some time ago after Katrina is look at the body language of both George and Laura Bush, and how while they would go talk to more people individually, you could really tell in their body language that they were very distant. But that's one of the things about photography. And maybe, John, you could talk about this as well, since Gerald doesn't have sound. But, how does the photographer convey the reality of the situation? George Bush making everybody feel better because he's actually out there patting people on the back, and Obama not sending that same message, so people think, oh, he's standoffish, and, he's not there.
Well, I don't think we should forget that the Louisiana coastline, in particular, is a fairly conservative part of the country. They may have wanted to limit the risk of an embarrassing photo shoot by exposing him to too many locals who probably have some serious qualms with him in the first place, aside from the whole effort with the cleanup.
Yeah, Erica, you had a comment.
Well, I was just thinking, listening to some of the comments and looking at these last two photographs, I think it's so important as photographers, but also as viewers, not to be misled by the quality of an image versus, the actualities of the situation. And obviously, both of these images of these two leaders are trying to convey a certain effect in order for propaganda, and I think that we need to look at their policies to really get the full story. And I think there is a tendency with these sort of iconic images to forget policy and to forget what's actually happening on the ground that is in stark comparison to what this photograph of Obama may actually be trying to convey.
Yeah, there may be actually a connecting point between what Erica is saying in terms of the reality on the ground, and then also how these photo ops are conceived and conducted. This picture actually shows Obama on his third trip to the Gulf. So just a little bit of context. He went down twice before, both times on a Friday afternoon, so he could be seen on the scene, but also where it was the very end of the weekly news cycle, so it wouldn't stir up too much of a backlash, given the fact that people were pretty upset in those first couple of weeks about the role of the government. So the first time he was down there, the photo op, the selection was him on shore with the Coast Guard, very kind of official and impersonal image. Second Friday afternoon, the following week, he was having lunch with fishermen. So I think that when they finally did this shot, they felt like that they really had, that Obama literally had to get more hands-on. So he was actually on the beach touching this toxic material, and then there was a series of shots of him meeting with cleanup crews. So it really was trying to get him, closer to the crisis.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I'm just thinking it's interesting in terms of the staging event, the way these guys are dressed. Tony Hayward looks odd because he doesn't look like he's very comfortable in those overalls and that helmet. It looks like it's set up. And why is he wearing that when he's on the boat on the bridge of a boat anyway? And Obama here, there's a misfit. There's almost a sort of a genre slippage between the way these guys are dressed. Tony Hayward looks very uncomfortable. The CEO should be in a suit, not in a kind of boiler suit and a helmet. And Obama here somehow also looks like he's in the wrong clothes. He's like, he turned up on the beach in his slacks, his business slacks, and he's rolled his sleeves up. He also looks out of place in terms of the clothing that he's wearing. And I think, it's interesting when, obviously photographers, media, I think photographers particularly, more so than TV crews, I think we're often constantly in a battle between the PR machine of the politics and photographers trying to subvert that. And I think you see, particularly in political election coverage, people like Chris Morris's work, and so on. And I've done it myself covering rallies. You're constantly trying to break that sort of forced, imposed reality that's been put on you by the PR people by trying to find a moment in the classic one that people, probably you actually won't remember this, but it was a classic PR stunt with Neil Kinnock when he was the leader of the Labour Party with his wife on a beach when they were supposedly kind of running along in the water, and they fell over and fell in the water, and it turned out to be a total disaster in terms of the PR sort of coverage. I think it's a constant battle between, visual image makers who are sophisticated and trying to subvert or undermine the PR machine in terms of trying to find a way to make these photo ops more interesting, more valuable, more discerning, really. But I do feel like somehow there's a misfit in both of these men in terms of the clothing they're wearing with the situation they're trying to deal with. And I think that's sending out all sorts of mixed messages to the viewer.
I just want to jump in and let folks know that we've got a couple minutes left. And Lee Barber, I want to recognize you had a comment or question. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you, everyone, for this really wonderful discussion. And I just wanted to ask a question about the ROV feeds that we've been seeing throughout this disaster. I mean, it seems like they've served to really distract and dehumanize what's going on here. I'm curious on the panel's take of this really weird contrast between the availability of images from this extremely remote environment versus the real difficulty in access and actually showing the people who are affected by this tragedy.
Great question, Lee.
I think it's kind of interesting. This is like the ultimate citizen photojournalist, isn't it? This is, a completely remote digital camera, because there's no other way in which the media can get access to the scene. It's almost like the absolute pinnacle of democratic journalism. It's a machine that's recording. It's like a CCTV camera almost. And I think it's a very compelling space visually that's been created here. This kind of ticker tape flow and all the arguments about the amount of flow that's been happening and so on and so forth. And that's a really intriguing point about the fact that we've been able to see this. I think it was one of those things where maybe they made a mistake in allowing this footage to be seen in the first place, but once the genie was out of the box, we were then completely sort of hooked on it as an extraordinary visual metaphor for this uncontrollable leap. And then obviously now, the footage we're getting now of them having shut it down as this kind of, closure, as it were, literally, of the story.
It is very disconcerting because as you say, there's been this endless flow, and we have been able to observe that. But it in a way, even though it's incredibly concrete, it really does become highly abstract since we can't see very well what's happening with all the oil that goes out of it. So it has a really strange and unique metaphoric capacity.
It strikes me also a bit like the debt clock that used to tick on. I don't know if it still does on 6th Avenue in New York City. It's just kind of a constant reminder. When you're not looking at it, it's still ticking away. And I think that cuts through all the propaganda. And
the clock is still there.
Yeah, and so, you know, like the pipe, it's you can kind of read what you want and hope what you want, but as long as this picture's still ticking away and you can see it, it doesn't matter what people say. The problem hasn't gone away.
I just want to jump in briefly and let folks know that we are officially done with our time here, but if folks are interested in hanging around for a few more minutes and still want to continue to talk, we do have one more image we didn't quite get to, and we could wrap up with that one if you want, but if you have to go, we understand that. This image, I think, in some ways corresponds to one of the questions that Sandra, I think, and Laurette asked us to think about with the edit as a whole, and that is, are we willing to talk about how beautiful some of these photographs are? Yeah, maybe you
John
can give
here.
it. Oh, go ahead, John.
Well, you know, I think that's a very valid question, but it's the same in any disaster, really. We cover disasters, human disasters, and oftentimes, whether it's environmental or human, some of the most striking images are also somehow the most beautiful as well. And the dichotomy between the dissonance between the horror and the beauty is sometimes what grabs people's attention and keeps you looking at that photo a few extra seconds or coming back to it later.
Yeah, I just want to note, folks who can see the image on the screen are probably seeing that we do have capability of drawing on these images, and someone has circled what look kind of like faces. Laurette, you had a comment?
Yes, and you know, this would also be directed to the photographers as well. One of the things that Michael, Shaw, and I talked about was the fact that Loie from 7 Photos did a series of much more personal images, close up some really, really beautiful things. But they're more contemplative about the beauty of the oil in this disaster, say compared with John's photograph of the bagged stuff on the beach. That too is incredibly beautiful, just as Carrie's image from the sky is so beautiful. And yet these don't really speak to what's going on in the Gulf. They're entirely removed from it, and tend to see these much more as a personal statement rather than something that's helping us to understand what's going on.
Yeah, Paul.
Well, I think it's a fiction to assume that situations of great distress cannot have within them elements of extraordinary, for want of a better word, beauty. I mean, you know, the coastline of Louisiana, I'm sure, is a very beautiful coastline. The oil on water creates fantastically abstract, beautiful patterns. And I think what's very interesting about that is our response to it. And I think Elaine Scarry's wonderful little book on beauty is a very interesting read in this capacity. I think, you know, what I took from her argument is that when we see a kind of a dichotomy or in terms of, you know, when we see beauty in terms of what we might call evil or distress, you know, our reaction to that's often very complex, and it's often going the wrong way. Rather than thinking, oh, that can't be right, you know, beauty shouldn't exist in that. Well, I think what she argues is that we should see the beauty as being almost a kind of a leveling force or something to aim for, and we should think that, well, if there is a potential for beauty in this scenario, we should make our efforts to enhance that. In other words, we should move more towards the good, as it were, and she sees beauty as reflecting good. And or worthiness rather than evil. And I think that's a really interesting kind of angle to take on this, you know, in the old sort of chestnut of the aestheticization of the ethics of aestheticization and so on. And that we too often respond with a very kind of knee-jerk, oh, you cannot have beauty in the face of horror, it's impossible. And yet clearly you can. I mean, it's something, it's a visual trope that comes up time and time again. And you know what John's picture reminded me of a lot was, you know, obviously someone like Simon Norfolk's, you know, battlescapes of Afghanistan and Iraq, you know, where we can read into or turn and pictures of you know, the wrecks of ships in great storms and so on. We can read into these sort of dramatic, epic situations, an epic, awesome, in the true sense of the word, beauty. And I think, you know, these two things can coexist, and in fact, beauty can be a call to action and not just admiration, as to sort of paraphrase another one of the critics of aesthetics versus ethics argument.
I actually thought that this image was, at least from a media standpoint and talking about photojournalism right now, is actually fairly subversive, you know, and really pushes the point of how much there's a possibility of, or a tendency even to aestheticize the news, and especially seeing how so many images are now and stories are just being reported by in the mainstream media on their websites by just creating these huge numbers of photo galleries with captions and really little other context. Lowy, who by the way shot this series for GQ, seems to me on one level turning the disaster into an art poster, or even more specifically in terms of, you know, how much stuff's being distributed online now, into like wallpaper or even a computer screensaver. I think it's great.
I completely agree with you, Michael, but I think it's terrible. You know, that you can certainly inhabit different places with your photographs, but it doesn't say half as much in terms of the intention and the kind of the fulfillment of the story by the photographers on the ground and actually what's going on. It just tells a story of a body of work, and like you say, it's either a screensaver or actually I think it's probably a print for sale in a gallery for a lot of money because it's rooted in the real. And I think there's terrible subversion with that.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's great because it is terrible.
Well, that I can't argue.
Well, I think we could keep going on with because the photos have such great impact and stimulus. I again just really wanted to thank the photographers, Erica and John and Carrie, for being here, and very much appreciate Gerald. And I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to hear you orally or in audio, but you just had a great impact in terms of the textually. So I want to thank everybody on behalf of Bag News Notes, and thank Kara, thank Paul, and I think this has just been really successful, and I look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, can I just come in there as well, Mike? I mean, I absolutely echo those comments, and I think this session has been exactly what we set out to try to achieve with OpenEye, which is, you know, mixing together practitioners, theory people, critics, you know, in a really rich mix in a discussion about really contemporary issues. So for me, this has been a brilliant session. Really, really enjoyed the to and fro, the debate, and very much absolutely bang on with our philosophy of trying to bring together lots of different voices, all interested in the same topic of how does photojournalism represent the world, but in mixing together people that perhaps quite often don't get to engage with each other in debate and discussion. I think it's been a great, great session. Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much. And absolutely, Michael, hopefully we'll make this a regular kind of meetup with Bag News Notes and OpenEye, and then really drill down on some more contemporary photographic issues and so on. So again, I'd like to thank all of the presenters and all the audience for taking their time out on a Sunday evening, afternoon, morning, depending on where you are in the world. And just absolutely brilliant session. Well done, everybody. And thank you very, very much. Cara, did you want to make any last comments before I switch off the archive?
I think maybe my last comment will be that this will be archived, right, Paul, so that we'll have a chance, folks who weren't able to be here in real time will be able to experience it. So definitely let people know that with a certain lag time, I'm not sure what that is, maybe Paul can let us know, this discussion will be archived and other folks can tap into all of the ideas and images here. And I'm very appreciative of being able to moderate a discussion with people that I could never be in a room with, right, because we're all far-flung. So this is really wonderful.
Absolutely. The archive will be available. It will be an MP4 file, so we'll be able to give that to the Bag News Notes and post on our website. Also, we'll host it up on OpenEye. And just a quick plug, we have got another session coming up on July the 22nd at 1500 GMT, which is about photographing the personal, with some really interesting photographers looking at how they photograph their own family life. And if you're interested in that, you can send me an email. I'm going to pop my email up here at the end, and I can send you more details on that. So again, once again, thank you all very, very much for attending today.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Have
All the
a
best.
great day or evening.